So I'm going to talk about some soybean production tips. And you notice I put in parentheses with help from Wisconsin. So why do we need help from those badgers? Well, I'll try to explain that. I think it will at least make it more entertaining, especially right after lunch. So I get the corn and soybean digest. And if you don't get that, I suggest you subscribing. There's the electronic form, and then there's also the paper copy. And in the current magazine, there's an article that features these three young men. They're grad students from the University of Wisconsin, and they work with the extension soybean specialist from Wisconsin. His name is Sean Conley. In the article, they talk about 9 basics for top soybean yields. And I thought this would be a good way to present some of the data from North Dakota. And so I'm going to go through and talk about each of the 9 subjects or tips they have for producing high yields. And then I'll follow with data from North Dakota and the recommendations. And I guess I'll tell you up front, we don't always agree. But maybe that's part of the fun of this. I underlined here, says that high yields are our job, and they mentioned producing 87 bushel soybeans despite a dry August. So I think we'll get right into it. So here's the first of the 9 tips. The first one is high yield genetics. Because good genetics can add 10 or 12 bushels per acre. And they mentioned the importance of selecting long maturity varieties to take advantage of the full season. But we don't want to get carried away, or that very long maturity variety might not be done before Mother Nature is, and in other words, we might get a frost that will knock our yields or our seed quality before the season is over. So I want to bring your attention to our soybean variety trial publication. I've got a stack of them in the front table. You can pick one up when you like. And so we have that available. That includes Carrington data as well as data from across the state. So as an example of using the data, I looked at our dryland Roundup Ready variety trial data. And the numbers worked out kind of nice. There was the 13 lowest yielding varieties. They were under 58 bushel per acre. And this is 19% of the total. And the total were 68 varieties that were tested in the trial. And then on the other end of the scale, the top 13 actually amounted to 19%, and they were above 65 bushel. And then down below I have the average bushel per acre. The average for this group, essentially the low 20% was 55.3 bushel, and for the top 20%, it was 67.3. And you notice the difference? 12 bushel. And so that corresponds with what those young fellows were stating. So it says high yield group averaged 12 bushel per acre, 18% better than the low yielding group. So those of you that have kids tonight, you can go home and you probably remind them, okay, you got your homework done, and if not, you better get on it. Well, I'm thinking, well, maybe the kids should remind their parents about doing some homework and variety selection. Because soybeans, $10 a bushel. If you could be in this top yielding group, there's $120 per acre by doing your homework. So I just want to emphasize the importance of studying your varieties before you do grow them. And then in that first statement, they mentioned maturity groups being important. And this is a glimpse of a trial that we looked at on planting dates. We planted very early, May 5th, and then compared to more of a typical time. This May 5th planting, that might have been the first soybeans in the ground in North Dakota last year, or this past season. But the story comes out where the longer maturity group certainly did yield better compared to the 08, compared to 0.2. What's a little puzzling to me is that with the early planted, with both of these, the response, the higher yield with early planting was the same between the two maturity groups. And I really expected the 0.8 long maturity group to have a higher yield response with the early planting versus the late. We do have other trials that we're looking at maturity dates as well as planting dates, and we'll have to explore that further. Number 2 is planting early. And they talk about delayed planting past the first week in May. Here in Madison costs such and such bushels per day. And we could calculate that information based on early planting dates. But to me, I think you guys have enough stress already. If you, you're planting your wheat and your corn and these other crops and think, oh man, if I don't get my soybean in, I'm missing out on a third or half a bushel a day. And so maybe we won't calculate that. Like I say, I think it just adds to your stress. But I do want to show you our yield response with early planting soybean. This is 5 trials we conducted in the area. The dates are listed on the bottom. For example, this past year, I showed you earlier the variety response, but we planted May 5th to May 23rd. And very consistent that we're seeing some nice yield increases simply by planting early. Are we at risk planting this last season, planting May 5th? Yes, most certainly. We did plant when the soil till was okay, but soil temperature was not okay. It was cold, and there were many mornings after we planted where there was frost on the ground. So it took a long time for the stand to establish. But what's interesting is our stand in this early planted was actually numerically a little bit higher than the May 23rd plant. So it took a long time for the plants to emerge, but we did have an inadequate stand. The soil temps were in the daytime average is in the mid-40s. And we'd like to see the soil temps, of course, at least 50, and higher would be better. Oh, and then I should mention that average across the 5 trials, the average yield response is 12% higher yields with early planted versus at the more normal planting date. Again, there's risk involved with pushing things early, but the payback appears to be evident with the data we've generated so far. So number 3, narrow rolls. So narrow rolls add more soybean yield than any other input because of much earlier canopy closure. And then we want to talk about this kitchen sink project. And maybe a lot of you are familiar with this. There's been a fair amount of publicity. It's been a multi-state effort over several years. They're looking at all kinds of different special inputs. But when it came down to it, just simply narrowing the roll spacing provided as much yield boost as any of the other inputs that they explored. They mentioned we want to close the canopy by R1. And just so happens I've been advising people who are challenging the same in North Dakota. It'd be really nice if you had a canopy field when we start flowering. It was almost impossible last year just because of our cool May, but it's, if we could do that, if we could have canopy closure early in July, that'll certainly keep our yield potential up in soybean. And then they mentioned any row width. Notice I didn't have this underlined because I don't quite agree with it. Any row width below 20 inches has about the same yield potential as what they're getting at here is solid seeding may yield quite similarly to the 15 or 20 inches. And we have some data to say that that may not be true. And then they mentioned white mold. If it is a concern, of course, it can drop the population, but they're suggesting not widening the rows. Michael Bunch will be on later. Michael will be telling the same story. At least I hope he is. So as an illustration, this is what we did a few years ago, looking at canopy closure based on row spacing and planting rate. And so we had the 2 planting rates, 150,000 pure live seeds, 200, and then obviously the 2 row spacings, 14 and 28. So this is the first treatment where we hit canopy closure. And it only took 1 more day with the lower planting rate to have canopy closure. But the big difference is look between row spacings. We have basically a month advantage with the 14-inch rows versus with the 30-inch. And all advantages that go with that early canopy closure. Conserving moisture, competition with weeds, and maybe the most is capturing as much light as possible for food production. Well, here's a look at a database 6 site years, just comparing row spacings. And we have a lot more data, but I think this tells the story really nicely. Indeed, we do see with the intermediate row spacing a yield advantage compared to wide rows. And we also see it though with solid seeding compared to the intermediate row spacing. But note that there's more of a gap here than there is here. And so that's where maybe I disagree a bit with the young Wisconsin fellows about maybe even tweaking out more yield by going with narrower rows compared to what is the standard for most people. So combined over 22 trials, just comparing the intermediate row spacing to the wide rows, we see a 3% yield advantage with the intermediate row spacing. And we've got enough data now where we can dig into it and maybe tweak out some more information as well, and I'll try to do that this winter. So moving on to number 4, soil fertility. Really the story here is that we like to have our P and K at critical levels, meaning at optimum levels where we can ensure that we have good yields. And in North Dakota, we're not sure what those levels are. Well, we have some numbers, but they could be tweaked one way or another. And I'll show you those numbers in just a bit. Also note that they said micronutrients did not contribute anything to soybean yields. And there's probably debate in the room about that. I'll show you some data to support this statement. So here's our standard fertility tables for phosphorus and potassium on soybean. And so here's currently where our critical levels would be, meaning high levels of the nutrients in the soil where we don't recommend any additional P or K being added. And with potassium, we may be pushing this down. It may be down to 100 is the critical level, meaning there's a more likelihood that we would recommend applying potassium because of yield increases. But for now, here's our critical levels. This is the Olsen test for phosphorus, 12 to 15 parts per million, and then as is shown for the potassium test. I'm sure most of you that are soybean growers have heard us say that if you have the choice, apply your phosphorus as a broadcast application versus a concentrated band. And so we've been trying to build a database to show that. And the progress has been slow, but we're making some progress. This is data from this past season. And this, I guess you can look at the information, the rates, and so forth. We started with the low testing soil. The phosphorus that was pre-plant incorporated was indeed mechanically incorporated. It wasn't just laid over the soil surface. And then we compared that to the banded application at planting. And we did see at least a trend for increased yield with the broadcast versus the 2-inch band. And both certainly show an advantage compared to the untreated check. And then this is a glimpse of some of our work we've done with special inputs. And this is a study we started last year with one of Winfield's products. This is Maxin Ultra ZMB. And here's the analysis, various products in that. And we applied it at a cord at the R1 to R2 stage. This was a 6-rep trial, and we did see at least a trend for a yield increase with this product. And at least indicating there's a chance of getting a true response. But this is just one trial. A database we'd have more confidence in is one here. This has 7 set years worth of data. This is a product that maybe some of you are familiar with. It's been around for quite a few years. The application rate and timings are here. There's analysis. And each year that we tested, we never statistically saw a difference in yield between untreated and the product. And then, well, if you don't care about the statistical things, just interested in the means, the 7-year average, you see a very slight increase in yield with this particular product. And so when you consider the economics of the trip across the field and the cost of the product, well, you can make your own decision on economics, but to me it doesn't look very promising. So moving on to factor number 5 of 9, use complete seed treatments. They mentioned use seed treatments that contain both fungicide and insecticide versus fungicide only. This was a graph and then the caption that I took from the Corn and Soybean Digest. I think that was last winter sometime this came out. And so I like this because it includes economics and seeding rates, and then as well as the 2 products that's being tested. The Apromax, of course, would have fungicide only, and the Max would be fungicide and insecticide. So they're showing, considering the economics that are listed, $9 beans, these are in 15-inch rolls, 9 site years. They're also looking at seeding rates, and then the cost of the products, that there's a chance for higher return by using the combination product. They only go at 140,000. NDSU continues to recommend 150,000 plants established. In Wisconsin, they're saying if you establish 100,000 plants per acre. I don't know if that's the beginning of the year or the end of the year, but their planting rate and the eventual stand recommendations are a little different than ours. But I think we have a few more stresses in North Dakota too compared to Wisconsin. We have a large database indicates 150,000 will maximize your yield potential versus lower rates such as 100,000. But here's the data that we've generated. This is just not one trial. This is a combination of 8 trials. A couple were conducted here at the center. Michael, I don't have your data from this year, and we'll visit about that. But yeah, a couple trials here, and then the bulk were in the valley. Trials that were conducted by Jan Knoll and her research specialist, Patrick Buzet. They were primarily looking at having insecticide treatment, Cruiser Max, as a way to deter soybean aphids and maybe other insects that are present. But by now you see that we're having a difficult time getting the yield response basically with both of these products. But in particular, things are just going the wrong way, and I'm not sure why.
Is that what Wisconsin is targeting aphids with their insecticide? Suppose, or they got some other?
I think they're concerned about soil-borne insects. And I know there is interest in the insecticide portion, providing some growth promoting capability in the plants too. So, but this is North Dakota data, and maybe as our database enlarges, the trend will go the other way. But for now, we're not seeing what they're finding in Wisconsin. However, we have a very large database, 28 trials over this period, that indicate with fungicide only that we see an average of 5% yield increase by treating the soybean seed. So moving on to number 6, they want to see us, or they recommend using pre-emergence herbicides, so do we. You heard Alicia's talk this morning about herbicide-resistant weed management, and she stressed about starting early, as in at the time of planting, and then when we use post-applied products, control the weeds when they're small. And we have somewhat of a chance in soybean to try to control them. But it talks about post-emergence herbicides offer limited modes of action, and they include glyphosate, Liberty Link, and then PPOs, that's the group 14s, and then ALS herbicides, that would be the group 2s. And we have very little post-emergence products, as Alicia had mentioned this morning. So we have to rely on soil-applied products to control some of these herbicide-resistant weeds. This young man mentions the future is bright with a lot more options. Well, he's young and maybe full of enthusiasm. I'm maybe a little more tempered and say, well, they're not dealing with kochia, number one. And so with kochia, what are some of the problems here? Already in North Dakota, we have dicamba-tolerant kochia, certainly 2,4-D tolerant. We know in other states, for example Kansas, where kochia is tolerant to the HPPDs, that would be group 27s, and the PPOs, group 14s, and we have kochia resistant to group 2s all over the state, have for a long time. So, and these are the dicamba tolerant soybean, the HPPD tolerant, and the new form of 2,4-D tolerance coming down the road. But are they going to help us on kochia? Maybe not. They'll be good on the pigweed family. We've been conducting a trial for the last few years, just looking at something very basic: the response of soybean by yield based on timing of the initial weed control. So we've got trials that we conducted at several locations in the state, and ultimately, as we would expect, at planting time, we would gain the highest yield if we start weed control then versus waiting until the weeds are at 2 to 4 inch height. This average, or this comparison, there's about a 5% yield advantage with this one. So 2 good reasons to start right at planting time. One is you can keep your yield potential up, and number two, that gives the opportunity to use soil applied products to help with resistant weed management. Okay, number 7, we're moving right along. SDM management. Tim Becker is going to talk about that next, and so he'll give you the details. The only thing I'll mention is, for we in this region, we need to start soil testing. Find out if we have cyst in our soils, so we can be ahead of the game and make sure that we manage it right. We are getting cyst. We have found cyst here at the center, and Sam Raquel, Extension plant pathologist, very soon will have a map of the survey that was done by maybe some of you and agents, and so we're, well, should I say looking forward to it, Scott? Probably not, but we know that the area in the state where FCN has been identified is expanding. Okay, number 8, scouting and know your field history. Yeah, we like to have people get out there and scout. We're concerned about these diseases as well as soybean cyst nematode, aphids, and then they also have white mold, but I didn't underline it. Also, they mentioned late season fungicide applications pay off in response to actual disease pressures, such as white mold, if things are done correctly, rather than plant health. Okay, what do we find in North Dakota? Yeah, we'd agree with that. Here's 31 site years, 31 trials conducted during this period. Sam Raquel put this together with help from I and others. We use either headline or Preoxer for plant health at these stages, primarily these stages, but some treatments are earlier, later. But with all that, only 5 of 31 of the trials where we had significant yield increase, 16%. Are those good odds? Well, you guys can decide on your own. If you're interested just in the means, again, the 31 site year mean shows a 2 bushel increase with the products versus untreated. But when you apply the economics, you know, it's break even at best. And number 9, we're there, and our time is just about up. It talks about other details. They talk about the soybean team. These young guys, they rotate beans and corn, so it apparently doesn't pay to use the inoculants. Well, the debate goes on. I'll show you a little bit of our own data. And then they talk about tillage systems, and in general, in their environment, reduced till or no till is not as good a fit as what we think we have in North Dakota. So I'll show you a little bit of data. This is 12 site years of data from Carrington East. Granted, most of this is valley work, comparing strip till grown beans to conventional till, and we see a long-term average with reduced tillage. If I put in the data from Minot and maybe other locations in the west, this number would even go up more. So we feel very good about conservation tillage helping us conserve some moisture when we really need it during the critical month of August. And then soybean seed inoculants. We've had a tough time showing data where you'll be convinced to always use the inoculant. And we're still struggling with that. But this is 8 site years of data showing a very modest yield increase, inoculated versus untreated, in trials where we know we had a recent soybean history. So this actually amounts to 2% yield advantage. So you guys aren't jumping up and down about this. Well, at least it's not 0. It was 0 not very long ago. Okay, so many with this chart that maybe a lot of you have seen. It is revised as of this month. I have lots of copies on the table, and we've gone through quite a few of these. We talked about tillage systems, not previous crop, but we see an advantage with having something other than soybean, giving us a yield advantage. We talked about planting date. I mentioned planting rate, row space we covered, fungicide, inoculation, phosphorus application as broadcast versus banned. Yeah, can't get too excited about that, but at least it's a positive number. It's showing the story that we want. And then finally, the timing of initial weed control advantage at planting versus early pulls. Okay, time-wise, I think we're good. If there's any questions you might have, I'm going to try to answer them. So it was wonderful having the Wisconsin crew support us today. We didn't have to pay $5,000 to bring them in, and we could give them a rebuttal, and they couldn't reply. And the question was, what insect we were targeting?
Yeah, the Cruiser Max is an insecticide, so the gain would be because we control the insect, right?
Yeah, that would be correct. We weren't in the valley. They were targeting soybean aphids, but I don't know if they're targeting any other soil insects. And here, when we use it, our interest was just making a comparison of the insecticide plus fungicide versus the fungicide to see if there's some added benefit. And on minimal testing, we have not seen that yet.